Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing the reading of Thousand Autumns, Volume 1, also known as Tian Qiu, by Meng Xi Shi. Today, because Chapter 13 is long, we will only be reading Chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 13, Dangerous Encounter. Early the next morning, they hastily buried the abbot and the two monks, then entered the city straight away. After what happened the night before, Chen Gong had become nervous and jumpy, like a bird that started at the sight of a bow. He was unwilling to stay in the city even a moment too long, and when he saw the local Liuhe Guild branch's signboard in the distance, he refused to move any closer and pulled Shun Qiao in the other direction. He didn't know whether to laugh or to cry at the boy. No one will notice us, said Shun Qiao. They don't even know our names. They're interested in other people, not us, so don't worry so much. Just then, a laugh sputtered from up above them, atop a wall. I think his concern is somewhat warranted myself. Although the light was so dim last night that I failed to notice how handsome this gentleman was, I almost passed you right by. The voice was sweet and delicate, but more importantly, it was alarmingly familiar. Chun Gong shuddered with recognition. Lifting his head, he saw a young girl sitting atop the wall, dark-haired and clothed in red. Her hair was bound in a bun by a golden hoop, and she was smiling right at them. A lovely, charming smile. Other than that voice, nothing about her resembled a young monk from the night before. On any other day of his life, if Chung Gong came face to face with such a beautiful girl while walking down the street, he would have been eyeing her up. But he remembered the three dead monks at the temple and the state he'd found them in. He went cold all over and couldn't muster the courage to give her a second look. Bai Rong was all smiles. Why so scared? Shouldn't you be happy to reunite with an old friend? I came here especially to find you. Since Shun Qiao couldn't see where she was precisely, he could only cup his hands in greeting in the direction of her voice. On what business does this maiden seek us out? Bai Rong pouted. Maiden? Ah, how dismally formal. My last name is Bai. I am called Bai Rong. It's also another name for the peony flower, so you can call me Little Peony. As she spoke, she leapt from the wall and was in front of them in a flash. Bai Rong seemed more interested in Shun Qiao, even reaching out a hand to touch his face. Just before her fingertips reached him, Shun Qiao seemed to sense them and took 2 steps back. Bai Rong giggled and got straight to the point. You were both there last night. One of you read out the scroll while the other listened from beginning to end, so both of you must remember quite a bit of its contents. Now, I want to write down everything that was on the scroll, but there are some lines I don't remember all too well. Hence, I need your help. As for a reward once we're finished, whether you desire riches or beauties, you'll get whatever you wish for. She drawled her final words into a sing-song tune, coquettish with a touch of flirtatiousness. It was enough to make any man's heart waver. Chung Gong's ears went hot, and he was about to agree when the hand on his shoulder pressed down hard. He came back to his senses and quickly started shaking his head like a rattledrum. I can't write or read. You found the wrong people, added Shun Xiao. He can't read, and I'm blind. Last night I just recited from the scroll. I didn't take in any of it. Once I finished, I forgot what it said. I'm afraid we can't help you. Bai Rong smiled gleefully. You're all panicky right now, so of course you can't remember. But once you come with me and give it some careful thought, perhaps you'll be able to recall a great deal. Can you really say no to such a pretty face? She didn't wait for an answer, reaching out to grab them both straight away. Alarm bells blared in Chunggong's mind. His body wanted to run, but for some reason, when he saw her white and slender hand reaching towards him, all the strength dropped out of him. He could only watch as that hand brushed his shoulder and his legs went weak. He collapsed onto the ground. Shirmei looked so excited. Is she about to kill someone again? A youthful face, extraordinarily beautiful, accompanied this voice that sounded so very old. The man alighted from the wall soft as a feather, then smiled at Bairong. Her expression shifted a touch. You so rarely see your Shishong, he said. Isn't Shirmei happy to see me? Reluctantly putting Shen Qiao and Cheng Gong aside, Bai Zhong focused her energies on dealing with the uninvited guest. What is Shishong saying? It just took me a moment to recover from the joy and surprise of seeing you after so long. Huo Xijing looked at her, the shadow of a smile upon his face. His gaze swept past Cheng Gong and landed on Shen Qiao, regarding him with deep interest. Such a handsome gentleman you have there. Since you're going to kill him anyway, Shirmei, why not give me the skin of his face first? Then you can kill him. Baizhong moved smoothly in front of Shen Qiao. Very funny, Shishong. I wasn't thinking of killing him. In fact, why is Shishong here? You couldn't have come all this way just to catch up with me. I heard that Shirmei had the opportunity of a lifetime last night. Since I happened to be passing through, I stopped by to check it out for myself. What are you playing at, Shishong? Your Shirmei can't understand you at all. Huo Xijing gave her a slight snort. Last night, outside a temple on the outskirts of the city, the Liu He Guild appeared with a scroll of the Zhuyang strategy, and you were right there on the scene. Word is, before Yan Wushi destroyed the scroll, he made someone read it aloud. With Shirmei's wits and intelligence, surely you wrote it down to hand over to our Shitsun, yes? Baizhong stuck out her tongue, pouting like a little girl. Considering how filial I am to him, of course, something like this has got to go to Shitsun. Surely you didn't swoop in here to steal the credit from me once you heard the news. I'm afraid I can't let that happen. Here's a good idea. How about you give it to me for safekeeping, and we'll head back to hand it over to Shitsuin together. That way, we need not fear you losing it. Baizhong laughed. Does Shishong take me for a fool? Huo Xijing also laughed. Distrusting your Shishong like this. It makes him so sad. These two martial siblings were laughing as they spoke, but each word concealed a knife, and both had their eyes on each other's openings and weaknesses. Baizhong dared not relax for a moment. Even when she knew Shen Qiao was escaping with Cheng Gong, she paid them no heed. All her attention was focused on Huo Xijing, afraid of falling to his ploy in a moment of carelessness. Huo Xijing raised an eyebrow. They've left. Isn't Shirmei going to chase after them? Baizhong was still smiling brightly. Shishong is more important to me. The words were spoken with deep, lingering affection, but in their hearts, both of them knew it for a lie. Chun Gong didn't even know how Shen Qiao had pulled him up and into a run. He couldn't see well, and even with his bamboo cane, he still stumbled and tripped as he went. Chun Gong had no strength left in him and could only give directions as he was dragged along behind. After they'd run for over half an hour, Chun Gong finally said, panting, Stop! Stop running! I can't run any further. Shen Qiao slowed his steps, but the look on his face stayed just as severe. He walked in the direction of the nearest inn. Chun Gong hastily asked, Shouldn't we leave the city? Leave the city right away and run. That way, that demon woman can't catch us. They're probably expecting us to leave the city too. All the more reason we can't. The city is full of people, so it'll be difficult for them to find us. First, we'll stay at the inn for the night. Then tomorrow, we'll look for a chance to leave. With that man around, her attention will be off us for a while. They entered the inn and asked for a room. Chun Gong noticed a heavy exhaustion on Shun Chao's face, despite how briskly he'd just been walking. He remembered that Shun Chao's body was much weaker than his own, and how he normally had to stop and gasp for air every few steps. Feeling a little bad for him, Chun Gong said, "I'll sleep on the floor tonight. You take the bed." Normally, Shun Chao would humbly refuse, but now he was truly depleted. Ever since Yan Wushi infused him with true tea and he'd overexerted his vision, his body had gone soft. Up until then, he'd been forcing himself to push through it, but now that he'd relaxed, his whole body felt unsteady and on the edge of collapse. Chun Gong was confused. They're martial siblings, Shishong and Shimei. So how come they're acting like enemies? That man was also kind of strange. His voice was old, but his face was so young. Shun Qiao rubbed at his temples. That's because he used a technique called Stolen Sky and Counterfeit Sun. What's that mean? Stolen sky and counterfeit sun? He thought to himself that the name sounded pretty imposing. It's a face changing technique, said Shun Qiao. You skin off a person's face, then use a special technique to fuse it with your own. That way, you can maintain your youthful beauty for all eternity. Those two are both difficult characters to deal with. If it hadn't been for their bickering, we wouldn't have been able to escape today. How can there be a technique that horrible? Chun Gong blurted out. His hair was standing on end from fear. Shun Chao couldn't force himself to keep going any longer. He simply lay down on his side, fully clothed. With a slight curl to his back and a small frown on his now stark white face, he looked like a man on death's door. When they'd first started traveling together, Chun Gong had been a little worried that Shun Chao might collapse at any moment. Later, he realized that Shun Chao just looked like that every day, and he became accustomed to it. Something occurred to Shun Gong and he asked, "Hey, didn't you say you can't remember anything? Then how did you know that guy used the face changing technique?" "Oh," said Shun Xiao. Sometimes I can remember a little." The corner of Chun Gong's mouth twitched. "Go to sleep. We need to wake up early tomorrow." Obviously, Shun Qiao wasn't willing to say more. He rolled over and put his back to him. There was nothing Chun Gong could do but lie down as well. That night he had a nightmare. He dreamt that his face had been skinned off and replaced with the wrinkled countenance of an old man. When he looked in the mirror, he could no longer recognize himself. In the end, he woke up with a start from the sheer terror of it. Then he looked around and saw that the sun had already risen and that the bed was completely empty. Shun Qiao was gone. Shocked, Chun Gong leapt up, his thoughts spiraling. When he touched the bed, he found no residual warmth, and right as he was struggling with whether or not to dash out and search for him, Shun Qiao pushed open the door and walked in. Chun Gong breathed a sigh of relief. "Where'd you go?" Although he'd never admitted, over the course of their travels, together Chun Gong had gotten used to having Shun Qiao around. An outside observer might think that Shun Qiao's blindness and poor health was an inconvenience to Chun Gong, who'd have to help him out all the time. But in truth, it was Chun Gong who relied on Shun Qiao for many things. It was thanks to Shun Qiao that they'd been spared many detours. Shun Qiao closed the door. Softly he said, "Let's part ways today." Chun Gong froze. Then he jumped to his feet. "Why?" "Once Bai Rong and her Shishong have finished arguing with each other, there's a chance they'll come looking for us. As for the Liu He Guild, although I dissuaded them when they wanted us to travel together, they may very well regret it." He paused, then sighed. "There's also that Mu Rong Qing. He's likely a martial expert who belongs to the imperial court. It would be easy for him to mobilize government forces to track us down. Although one of us is blind and the other illiterate, the temptation presented by the Juyong strategy is irresistible. Many people spend their entire lives in tireless pursuit of it and end up empty handed, and we were able to listen to its contents. Compared to everyone else who was there, we're the softest of persimmons, the weakest and easiest target. Any person from the Jianghu could end our lives. Then, then what do we do? Chun Gong stammered. We didn't mean to listen. Who'd want to listen to something that convoluted? An ordinary man bears no sin, but holding a precious stone will cast him as a sinner. Last night, they saw us together, so that's the impression they received. Today, for the sake of our safety, we must go our separate ways. Chun Gong was at a loss for a moment. Finally, he came to see that it was a hopeless problem, and this was the only solution. If it came down to a fight, they could be knocked to the ground by a single palm strike. A sense of helplessness welled up inside him, then twisted into an even deeper despair. Chun Gong hated his own powerlessness, but there was nothing he could do. Very well, he said reluctantly, and looked at Shun Xiao. But can you make it on your own? Shun Xiao smiled. Why not? Didn't you see me doing well on my own back in Funing County? After some thought, Chun Gong conceded, but his mood didn't lift at all. Then, after we leave the city, will we ever see each other again? That's up to fate, said Shun Xiao. Will you still go to the Liu He Guild? Chun Gong shook his head. He was very certain. That deputy leader already recognizes me. If I go to the Liu He Guild, I'll just be walking myself into a trap. Everyone knows that I've heard the contents of that stupid scroll, so they definitely try to pry something out of me. Then where will you go? Chun Gong was depressed. I'll take things one step at a time. Maybe when I run out of money, I'll settle down right then and there. In the end, I gotta eat. The Liu He Guild is a major organization after all, so their threshold for entry is high. Even if you manage to get in, they might not treat you well. Why not seek out a small guild that's upright and just? With your intelligence, I'm sure you'll find success very quickly. Whatever. I just don't want to head south anymore. I want to go north instead, to go check out Yechung. I've heard that it's really booming, so there should be a lot of chances to get ahead. Chung Gong said this without much enthusiasm. He didn't have many belongings to pack. All he had with him were two old pieces of clothing. Once he'd fastened his sack, he could leave. Before he did, he looked back and saw Shen Xiao sitting there quietly, bamboo cane in front of him. Although his eyes lacked any life, his face was turned in Chung Gong's direction, as if to see him off. For some reason, Chung Gong felt a lump in his throat. You take care. Shen Xiao nodded. You as well. They were two people who'd met by chance, like drifting duckweed. Fate ordained that they travel together, and now, as fate would have it, they were parting ways. It was a remarkably common situation, but the teenage Chung Gong had not yet learned to take such things in stride. Shortly after Chung Gong left, Shun Xiao packed his clothes and prepared to leave the city. He had picked the south gate so as not to bump into Chung Gong. The two of them going their separate ways made each one less of a target, but Shun Xiao had other reasons as well. On the way out of the city, Chung Gong was in a constant state of apprehension. Only when he saw that no one had tailed him or headed him off was his mind finally put at ease. Huai Province was close to Zhou and was frequented by merchants traveling back and forth from one to the other. During the day, people even gathered outside the city gates, picking through the wares for sale, their shouts rising and falling in turn, making for a lively scene. Initially, Chung Gong had been so preoccupied with avoiding these powerful characters that he hadn't had time to give his surroundings a close look. Now that he found himself in a busy market, a teenage youth's love of watching the hustle and bustle reared up again. But he didn't dare wander about too much. After a quick look around and buying two steaming pieces of flatbread for the road, fresh off the stove, he followed the main road north. After 100 or so steps, he heard a stampede of horses' hooves, interspersed with the sounds of screaming and crying. Chungong quickly turned around and saw several people charging out from the city at full speed, running in his direction. Behind them followed a large troop of men atop horses, armed with bows and arrows, galloping wildly. He didn't know what was going on and stood there blankly for a moment, watching as all those people drew closer and closer. The men on horseback had already drawn their bows and nocked their arrows, preparing to shoot in his direction. Seeing that, Chungong was scared out of his stupor and instinctively began running as well, his mind still in a muddle, bewildered that such a scene could suddenly pop up when everything had been perfectly fine just a moment before. He wasn't the only one. The commoners in the city gates were also in complete chaos, fleeing in all directions, screaming over and over again in alarm. Chungong dared not look back. He sprinted forward like his life was on the line. His luck was seriously abysmal, he thought to himself. Things like this happened wherever he went. After he'd been running for a while, there came the sound of an arrow whistling through the air. It whizzed past Chungong's ear and sliced into the thick brush right in front of him. He went weak in the knees and almost fell straight down onto his face. From behind him came intermittent screams and sounds of people falling, along with the distant, drifting laughter of the men on horseback, who sounded very pleased. He even heard someone fawning. Ha! The commandery prince is truly a great archer. This must be what they mean by piercing a willow leaf from 100 paces, and not a single shot missed. The laughter stopped abruptly as the man responsible abruptly raised his head. The fastest runner in front here. Don't target him, any of you. He's mine. Who could run faster than Chung Gong? No one. All of a sudden, he understood what was going on. Most dignitaries loved hunting, but some were especially perverse. What they loved to hunt weren't animals, but live people. They'd release prisoners and slaves, command them to run with all their might, and shoot arrows at them with no regard for whether they lived or died. They called it human hunting. Chung Gong had only heard about it after he left Funing County. At the time, he'd found it outlandish and clicked his tongue at the idea. But now that it was actually happening to him, exactly like the tale from the storyteller, it wasn't amusing in the slightest. Knowing now that the stories were true, his heart pounded like a drum. It was about to thump out of his chest. All of a sudden, Chungong stopped and turned around. Prostrating himself on the ground, he begged loudly, "Please have mercy, Your Excellency. Please have mercy. I'm not prey, much less a prisoner or a slave. I'm a good citizen." So what? If a prince wishes to kill you, he can. The man at the head of the hunting party laughed, utterly unconcerned. When he got a good look at Chung Gong, though, he made a sound of surprise. "You, raise your head so I can see you." Steeling himself, Chung Gong looked up, fear and dread written all over his face. But Mu Tipua was amused by what he saw. "Your complexion's a little dark, but it's still quite delicate, and your limbs look supple too. If I were to spare your life, what would you give me in return?" Chung Gong was still in a muddle. "This lowly commoner is willing to be a beast of burden for your esteemed self, or is happy to be banished by your excellency." Mutipua chuckled. "Very well. Someone come and take him back and clean him for me." Chung Gong had left home at a young age and was by no means ignorant of the ways of the world. When he saw how the gathered crowd looked at him with strange expressions and put it together with what the man had said, he figured it out. He'd be taken as a male concubine. Male concubines weren't uncommon in Qi, especially in the upper echelons of the nobility, as the few generations of Qi's emperors had taken both men and women as partners. Since subordinates followed their leader's example, the lower levels of the nobles became quite interested in homosexuality as well. Chunggong wasn't aware that he'd caught the eye of the most famous official and most favored of the Emperor of Qi himself. But nevertheless, he felt his soul about to flee in terror. He kowtowed and exclaimed, "Spare me, Your Excellency. There's nothing charming about me. I don't want to go back with you." Mutipo's expression went dark. Chunggong's heart thudded in his chest. He'd picked up a couple of moves from Shen Qiao, but here he stood against a large troop of armed men on horses, their eyes ablaze. His rough, scanty martial arts would be completely useless. He'd probably be pierced through by 10,000 arrows before he took one step. Once Chunggong had thought himself fearless. At this moment, he felt childish and ridiculous. He hadn't been afraid before because he was always in situations that he knew how to handle. But now, he was terrified. Because when it came to these influential bigwigs before him, who he knew nothing of, Chunggong didn't need to know who they were exactly to understand that he absolutely must not provoke them. An attendant laughed from the sidelines. "Commandery Prince, this lowly one has never seen anyone so tactless before." Another person echoed him. "Truly, the boy isn't even especially beautiful. It's his great fortune that the Commandery Prince took a liking to him, yet he still has the gall to refuse. He might as well be shot dead on the spot." Mutipo's eyes narrowed, and he slowly raised the bow and arrow in his hand. "Your Excellency, please allow this lowly one to explain." Chunggong's mind buzzed, then abruptly went blank. With no time to think it through, he blurted out, "This lowly one lacks charm and is unworthy of such high regard from Your Excellency. But this lowly one knows a man. The man is much better looking than I am. No, he's better looking than all these people Your Excellency has with you combined." All those following behind Mutipo were beautiful men. When they heard Chunggong, they burst into laughter, ridiculing him for being rustic and unworldly. "Look at this hillbilly. He actually thinks he's seen a man more beautiful than us?" Mutipo didn't speak. He'd already had a white plumed arrow in his hand. He seemed ready to knock it and shoot. Chunggong was drenched in a cold sweat. This was a critical life and death moment. He couldn't afford to have second thoughts. "He's right here in the city," he said loudly. "We've only just parted ways. If Your Excellency doesn't believe me, I can take you to him. He's a natural beauty, but his eyes don't work so well. He's a blind man, so I'm afraid that Your Excellency will find him unsatisfactory." When he heard Chunggong say the man was blind, Mutipo finally took a little interest. "Come to think of it, I've never played with a blind man before," he said. "I suppose this means when I tie him to the bed, I won't have to blindfold him?" His frivolous tone drew a wave of low, sinister laughter. Now Chunggong saw just how loathsome these men were, but he'd already said what he'd said, and it was too late for regrets. He thought to himself, Shen Qiao was more skilled than him, so perhaps he'd be able to beat these people back. Or perhaps by the time they got there, Shen Qiao would have left already. This chaotic jumble flashed through his mind as he stayed frozen in place, unmoving. An attendant rode up to him, chin held high. "Hurry up and take us there." Chunggong gritted his teeth. "Your Excellency, in truth, the man is in poor health, even though he's good looking. I'm afraid it will spoil your mood." "Isn't that even better?" Mutipo said blithely. "A sickly man can be enjoyable in his own way." If he dies while I'm playing with him, it'd be because of his poor health. It can't be blamed on me. But if you don't want to lead us to him, you can be his substitute. You're healthy, so it'll be fine no matter how I play with you. I'll strip you bare and let my pet wolf dogs play with you. How about that? They just happen to be in heat now, and I was worried that I wouldn't be able to find mates for them. Chungong's eyes went wide. He'd never imagined that the world would have such cruel and savage people in it. Mutipo's threats left him trembling all over, and he could no longer muster up the will to resist. Don't blame me, Shenqiao. I was forced to, he thought to himself. Chungong led the large troop of men on horseback into the city. Then they arrived at the inn. Only a half day had passed since he'd left. The innkeeper still remembered him. When he saw that Chungong had returned and saw who he was with, he dared not ignore the boy and rushed to welcome him. This is... Chungong couldn't help but glance back at Mutipoa, who was frowning and covering his nose at the sight of the inn's humble interior. He sent a few attendants inside with Chungong to keep an eye on him. The man who stayed with me, is he still here? Chungong motioned at his eyes. His eyes aren't very good, and he has a bamboo cane. Yes, he's here, the innkeeper replied quickly. He's still in the room and hasn't come down. Chungong's heart filled with joy, swiftly followed by a small wave of guilt. But the guilty feeling didn't last long before it was interrupted. Mutipoa's attendant frowned. What are you dawdling for? He yelled. Take us up there. The man was coated in powder, and the scent of something pretentious and gaudy seemed to waft from him. Chungong didn't want to look at him more than once, but he had no way to defy his words. He had no choice but to bring everyone up the stairs, although he went very slowly. Part of him hoped that Shenqiao had in fact left, but another part hoped he was still there. Chungong led the group upstairs and knocked. After 3 knocks, a familiar voice came from inside. Who is it? Chungong couldn't have said what he felt in that moment. He swallowed and then said, It's me. Chungong, why did you return? Quickly, come in. Shenqiao was a little surprised, but his voice was as calm as ever. Full of conflicting emotions, Chungong felt his guilt rise in him again. Why aren't you going in? Impatient, Mutipoa's assistant gave him a hard shove. Chungong stumbled forwards, ramming the door open along the way. Shenqiao was sitting by the window with his face turned slightly towards it, as if enjoying the scenery outside. But Chungong knew that since that night at the temple, Shenqiao hadn't been able to see anything at all. Ha! So that's your so-called beauty? He's not The attendant's words ground to a halt when Shenqiao turned his head toward them, and it became difficult to continue. Mutipoa had weighted himself into impatience and decided to come upstairs personally. His eyes lit up when he saw Shenqiao. Mutipoa came from a poor background, but then his mother gained influence, while he himself ended up close friends with the emperor. And through these associations, he was able to live a life of extravagance. His origins meant he placed a great deal of importance on dress. He wouldn't let anyone in his sight whose clothes and adornments lacked the proper splendor. Shenqiao's clothes were of plain materials, and his hair was pulled into a simple bun. He didn't even have a jade hairpin. It was only held in place by a strip of sky blue ribbon, the same color as his clothing. And yet, Mutipoa couldn't tear his eyes away from him. Those rough garments did nothing to conceal Shenqiao's overwhelming beauty. When Shenqiao turned his face over at him, expressionless, Mutipoa's mouth went dry. He could barely restrain himself from going right up and pushing him down, ripping open those clothes and ravaging him. Chungong, whom did you bring here with you? When he heard that gently bewildered voice, Mutipoa's excitement swelled. What would this man taste like, he wondered, with his brows pinched and crying out. Mutipur had even already decided to hold this man here in Huai province first, until he'd played with him enough. Then he'd send him to Emperor Gao Wei of Qi. Gao Wei was like him. He always loved playing with unusual things. If Mutipur sent this blind beauty to him, the emperor would undoubtedly be pleased. What is your name? He asked Shenqiao. Shenqiao knit his brows but did not answer. He only said, Chungong. Chapter 14. Betrayal. Chungong knew that Shenqiao couldn't see him, but he still shrank from his line of sight. Mutipur chortled at this. Chungong told me that there was a beauty here, 100 times more beautiful than all my men. At first, I didn't believe him. I thought this kid hadn't seen enough of the world and was only spewing nonsense. So I came with him to take a look. But now that I've seen you, I know he wasn't exaggerating. Shenqiao was silent, his expression blank. Mutipur thought nothing of his reaction. I am the Prince of Chenyang Commandery, Mutipur. I am greatly His Majesty's favorite these days. If you're willing to come with me, from now on you'll receive only the best food and apparel. You'll be honored and live in splendor. You needn't stay in such a crude place. Only then did Shen Qiao sigh. Chun Gong, did you tell them where I was? Chun Gong was miserable, but he forged ahead. I had no choice. If I didn't bring him here, I'd have to go to work as a beast of burden for Commandery Prince Mu. Shen Qiao shook his head. Then you should ask this Prince of Chenyang Commandery whether he's willing to let you go. Mutipur laughed. That's right. Though this kid can't compare to even one finger of your hand, but he's whole and he's healthy, and his mind agile. His face isn't bad either. Good enough to be a servant. Chung Gong was stunned. You said you'd let me go. Mutipur paid the boy no heed at all. At the wave of his hand, his attendant stepped forward and grabbed Chung Gong. Meanwhile, Mutipur approached Shen Qiao. Perhaps sensing his approach, Shen Qiao finally stood, supporting himself with the edge of the table. It almost looked as if he was about to bow to the county prince in greeting. A smile tugged on the corner of Mutipur's mouth. All was going as expected. In the face of power and influence, no one could escape either fear or envy. The fearful trembled in trepidation, while the envious were drawn as moths to flame. Even if a man seemed reluctant now, he would soon become accustomed to the riches and wealth, the allure of women, and even come to love them. Even if he wanted out some day, by that point, it wouldn't be up to him. What is your name? Asked Mutipur. My name is Shen Qiao. Qiao, as in Da Qiao or Xiao Qiao. A rather fitting name. Qiao, as in mountain peak. Mutipur raised an eyebrow and smiled. As in, the 100 gods does he placate? The peaks and rivers all come partake? This Qiao is a little harsh, not as fitting for beauty. Shen Qiao did not return his smile. I think it's a good name. Fine, fine, as long as you like it. Do you have a courtesy name? Or shall I call you Xiao Qiao? Ah Qiao? Mutipur was smiling as he spoke, his tone doting and gracious. Shen Qiao bent to pick up his bamboo cane. As he did, his collar drooped to reveal a glimpse of his neck, snow white and slender, enough to elicit fanciful thoughts. An itch spread in Mutipur's heart. He couldn't resist reaching out to touch him. He wanted to pull the man into his arms, to draw them intimately together. Shen Xiao's body temperature was on the low side, and he'd lost weight due to his illness. When Mutipur grasped his wrist, he could feel the bones protruding beneath his thin skin. On any other day, given Mutipo's high standards for beauties, he'd have written Shenxiao off, saying that he felt too bony to hold. But today, Mutipo's heart jolted with eager impatience. Ah, Chiao. That was all he said, and that was all he had time to say. For just then, Mutipoa felt a pain in his chest. He looked down. The bamboo cane had somehow gotten in front of him and jabbed right into the spot above his heart. Mutipoa reacted quickly. After the pain, he leaned his torso back smoothly, one of his hands moving to grab the cane while the other struck out at Shen Qiao. He wasn't a forgiving person, and that this fragile, harmless looking beauty had the cheek to attack him unawares made him all the more furious. The blow he struck was merciless. Mutipur was also a martial artist. Even though his level was only second or third rate, if he really hit Shen Xiao with the palm strike, it would seriously injure him, if not kill him outright. However, in an unexpected turn of events, the cane Mutipur had gripped so securely slipped nimbly out of his hand and out of his control. Not only that, his striking hand failed to connect. This man he'd thought a sickly beauty had evaded the attack using extraordinary footwork and even countered it by hitting Mutipur's waist with his cane. Shunqiao had no internal energy, so he couldn't seriously injure Mutipur, but the blow caught him right at the weakest point in his ribs. Taken by surprise, Mutipur didn't use his true chi to shield himself, so the hit was painful. So painful that tears came to his eyes. He cried out involuntarily and quickly stepped back. Only then did his retinue of attendants pull themselves together. Some came forward to support Mutipur, while others swarmed around Shen Xiao, ready to take him down. Mutipur never thought he'd suffer such humiliation. His face grew stormy, dark, and violent. He'd glared viciously at Shen Xiao, naked rage shining in his eyes. He'd already thought up hundreds of ways to torture him. Capture him alive! The attendants Mutipur brought with him didn't lack for skill. Secure in their superior numbers, they weren't taking this blind, sickly man seriously at all. But each and every one of them was met with defeat. With just one bamboo cane, he held them all at bay. And that wasn't all. Shunqiao seemed to know that Mutipur's party was large in number, for he wasted no time. His attacks became increasingly ruthless. His face, normally so delicate, froze over with a layer of cold severity. One man tried to circle around and seize him from behind. He was immediately smacked away by the cane, sent staggering back several paces. Merciless, Shen Qiao followed up by shoving him straight out the window. Screams drifted up from 2 floors down. The crowd of men grew fearful. For a moment, they forgot to move. Anyone else want to try? Shen Qiao's face was inscrutable as he seemed to watch them. With the light tap, he set the end of his cane onto the floor and stood, firm and immovable. Though his complexion was still pale, a faint, forbidding chill had settled over it. Chung Gong was dumbfounded. When he'd watched Shen Qiao beat back the beggars, they'd still been in the broken down temple. He'd known that Shen Qiao had probably been a martial expert back before he lost his memory and fell ill. But after that, he'd seen the likes of Yan Wushi and Xue Ting fight, and it was like his view had broadened. He didn't think Shen Qiao was particularly powerful anymore. Until just then. Chung Gong thought he'd glimpsed many of the secrets of this man, but it seemed he was still in the dark, completely clueless. Mutipur felt humiliated. He was furious with Shen Qiao, and he was frustrated by him. One moment he wanted to kill the man, but the next he felt like killing him wouldn't be enough. That he had to catch him alive, take him away, fuck him 8 to 10 times, and then toss him to his subordinates and let them play with him until he died. Only then would the rage in his heart be relieved. He looked left and right, seeing the hesitation on everyone's face and their reluctance to move. There's so many of you, and you can't defeat one blind man? If nothing else, you can crush him to death with the weight of your bodies, he cursed. Still, the men hesitated, mainly because they'd been cowed by the fight and were all nursing some injury or another. None of them had thought that Shen Qiao could use a bamboo cane to do such damage. Shen Qiao's expression was indifferent. He stood there without speaking and seemed to be waiting for them to either leave or continue their provocations. Mutipo sneered. You didn't use any internal energy. You won't be able to hold on for long with only clever tricks. My men have surrounded the inn. If you're sensible, you'll kneel down obediently and beg for mercy. I might still give you a way out. Otherwise, otherwise what? Asked Shen Qiao. Mutipo's face turned savage. Otherwise. Before he could finish speaking, he saw Shen Qiao's palm strike out sideways. They were shocked. They'd all thought Shen Qiao had no internal energy. His strike whipped up an air current, blowing the cabinet right over. Startled, they were forced to evade. Mutipoa was right nearby the cabinet, and he had nowhere to retreat, but could only dodge to the side. Shen Xiao took advantage of this movement to strike Mutipoa in the back. Mutipoa immediately counterattacked, but he'd fallen right into Shen Xiao's trap. With a furl of his sleeve, Shen Xiao snagged his wrist and pulled Mutipoa to the window. He wrapped his other hand around the commandery prince's throat. It choked him, squeezing him until he couldn't breathe, and the other hand clamped hard over his gate of life, so he was too afraid to use his true qi. If you do this, you'll, he gasped and choked, only bring about your death. After playing the hawk for so long, Mutipoa never thought he'd have his eyes pecked out by a true raptor. He was half mad with rage, but too afraid to make any sudden movements. But who could have anticipated it? Despite Shen Qiao's appearance, he'd still made complete fools out of all of them. Whether or not it'll bring about my death, I do not know. But I do know that if you don't let me leave here today, you'll die first. Shen Qiao's voice was calm and quiet, not a spark of anger in it at all. Occasionally, it was even broken by a slight cough. In exchange for my insignificant life, I'd take the life of your excellency. That's a fantastic deal. How on earth had he judged so poorly? Mutipoa had actually thought this man harmless and weak. With no way out, Mutipoa had no choice but to tell his glaring attendants to stand down. Go outside and tell them to withdraw. Shen Qiao sighed. If only the commandery prince had been so cooperative earlier. Go, and please escort me outside the city. Then call a carriage for me. What's the use of a carriage when you're blind? Mutipoa sneered. Or do you want me to send you a coachman too? Shen Qiao mused over this. Commandery Prince Mu has a good point. Please accompany me for some time. I'm sure the coachman won't dare disobey. Mutipoa fumed. And so, they headed out together, and Mutipoa was forced into the carriage. With the commandery prince present, the coachman dared not question. The carriage headed west, traveling for 2 days and a night until they approached the border with northern Zhou. Once he was sure Mutipoa's entourage couldn't catch up with them, Shen Qiao finally let the coachman leave with the carriage. Then, with Mutipoa as his hostage, he entered an inn close to the border in Yanshou County. He knocked the prince out, castrated him to prevent him from harming others in the future, and then tossed him into a random room at the inn. Only when all this was done did Shen Qiao leave alone. Once outside of the inn, he headed briskly in the direction of the city gates. He only made it a couple of steps before he was forced to stop. He sought out an out-of-the-way, deserted alley corner and leaned against the wall. He was spent, exhausted, and couldn't hold himself up any longer. Bending over at the waist, he coughed up a large mouthful of blood. From beside him came the mocking sound of a laugh. Shen Qiao didn't need to look up to know who it was. He wiped away the blood from the corner of his mouth with a sleeve, then simply slid down the wall and sat. At some point, a man in blue had appeared. His face was handsome, his demeanor imperious. At the corners of his narrow eyes were a fine smattering of delicate lines that only served to lend him an inexpressible charm. Yan Wushi stood with his hands clasped behind him. At the sight of Shen Chao's pale face, like a lamp that had run out of oil, he clicked his tongue. Even though you parted ways with Changong for his own safety, in the end, your good intentions were met with betrayal. That Chun lad didn't want to end up Mutipo's exclusive property, so he sold you out. Well, how does it feel playing the good guy? Shen Chao's chest was boiling over with nausea. He covered his mouth, sorely wishing to cough up more giant mouthfuls of blood. Maybe that would bring him relief. You're wrong. That night at Chu Yuan Temple, I was the one who read the scroll, and I'm the one who's literate, not Changong. Even if he had an extraordinary memory, good enough to memorize every line, he'd only know the words, not their meaning. If the Liu He Guild wanted to seek us out, they'd only target me. I parted ways with him so I wouldn't get him tangled in my problems. If he met some misfortune because of me, my conscience wouldn't be able to bear it. After this long speech, his strength was flagging, forcing him to pause. He gasped down a couple of breaths, then continued. I can't predict the future. I couldn't have known he'd encounter Mutipoa, and couldn't have known that he'd bring trouble to my door in order to save himself. But even if I had known, I couldn't take it out on him, not with a clean conscience. All right, everyone, so that concludes the reading of chapters 13 and 14. I don't know about y'all, but Mutipoa is like disgusting, downright disgusting. And I'm a very understanding person. I totally understand why Changong did what he did and even his thought process that Meng Xi Shi explained, like, hoping Shen Qiao wasn't actually there, while also like maybe hoping it was, yada yada yada. But right now I just want to punch him. Like I really want to punch him on behalf of Shen Qiao since Shen Qiao thinks that in all fairness that he can't do it. So Shun Gaga, let me do it for you, okay?